okay? So we can turn this around and look at poverty and the relationship between poverty and democracy. Of the 38 countries ranking low, that is the lowest category, low, on the 2017 UNDP Human Development Index, the percentage that are democracies is not zero, okay? If you read some of the literature, you might expect, read Lipset's arguments about economic development and democracy. You might expect that, how could a poor country where people are, kind of desperate and it's hard to have a patient and calm attitude toward politics because you're so dependent on political power to get ahead. How could a poor country sustain democracy? Well, about 30% of the poorest countries in the world, for quite some time now, I'd say for the last 25 years, we've been in that kind of 25 to 30% range in terms of the poorest block of countries on the Human Development Index being democracies. Now I want to repeat, and we'll see the data in a moment, very few of them can meet a kind of minimal test of liberal democracy, but some of them have been democratic and rather robust for a period of time. More importantly, look at this. With every step up the ladder of human development, okay, from low human development to medium, from medium to high, from high to very high, you see this step pattern where the presence of democracy increases as you go up the ladder of human development. Now, you can see a big jump here from medium to high, big jump from low to medium. Why is there such a small jump from high to very high? I've given you the answer already. It's a three-letter word.
Oil countries.
Oil, yeah. Okay. So you want to know what happens when we take the oil countries out of this? Let's take all the countries that from that same figure I showed you before that get 60% of or more of their export earnings from oil and gas exports and take them out. So we're going to go down from 58 to about 48 countries. We'll take out UAE, Saudi Arabia. We'll also take out Norway. And this is what you get. When you take out the very high, when you take out the non-oil countries from very high human development, then you've got 92%. Like what you're left with is basically Singapore, Malaysia, and to my surprise, I can't figure out how it gets into the high human development category, but it does. Belarus, just barely, according to the UN statistics. But almost all of them are now democracies. This was the pattern about 10 years ago, 9 years ago, when they had 5 categories in the UNDP, but again, you see this step pattern. So it was actually not quite as dramatic then as now, yeah? Huh?
Democracy? Are you saying Belarus is a democracy?
No, I can't say, it is not a democracy.
Oh, okay.
I can't see why Belarus has high human development, but I didn't think of it as such a developed country.
They have pretty good healthcare.
They have health care and it's a very educated country.
Healthcare and education.
Yeah. Okay, now let's look at the bottom end just so I can unpack this for you. Who are these poor countries that are democracies, defying the odds? Well, I will say, several of them are kind of small, not very small, but Solomon Islands. You've got, most of them are in Africa. So Lesotho, Malawi, Liberia, Sierra Leone. Papua New Guinea also in the South Pacific. Nepal has left and come back. Madagascar has left and come back. Then you've got the two most liberal ones, Benin and Senegal. Senegal's undergoing another test right now because it's going to have presidential elections this spring, and one of the most potent potential opposition candidates is the mayor of Dakar is sitting in jail right now, which raises questions about whether this relatively good Freedom House score is quite so justified. But in any case, one of the things I want to note for you is how much movement there's been in and out of this category of low human development democracies, okay? And you're going to see this when we talk about the article in a moment by Adam Przeworski and his colleagues called What Makes Democracies Endure, where he just computes based on development levels, hazard, what he calls, it's called in the statistical literature, hazard rates, the probability of a democracy failing. And it's high when you have low human development or low economic development. Did someone have a question here? Because I think there was a period in the early years after the transition when there were relatively free and fair elections, and it could be said to have had a kind of rough electoral democracy. But it just wasn't sustained as a result of electoral fraud, corruption, and bad governance. You could make the argument, some of my colleagues do, it never really met the test. Others say, well, they had a reasonably free and fair presidential election 4 years ago. They're about to have another very soon. So, maybe we should really call it a democracy now. This raises, I thank you for your question, because it raises another issue, which is, as I told you before, there are a lot of countries that are in that gray zone where it's hard to know whether we should call them an electoral democracy or a competitive authoritarian regime. It's kind of really ambiguous. And many of these countries have been or are, I'd say Nigeria kind of is now. Bangladesh, I don't even think it's ambiguous. But some of these, it's kind of rough. Look at these, again, on the 7-point scale, a 4 on civil liberties. It's a pretty illiberal score. So some of these are, they're not, I do believe they're electoral democracies. There's real electoral uncertainty and potential for electoral alternation, and often the reality of it, as in Liberia. But there's a lot of grayness in this zone, okay? So we can summarize by saying at the highest level of human development, most of the non-oil countries are democracies. Virtually all of these are liberal democracies. There's a few non-democracies in that category. 4, Singapore, I would argue Hungary now, even though Freedom House still, for reasons beyond me, classifies Hungary as a democracy. Malaysia, but Malaysia actually had a transition to a much more competitive and open electoral system and the defeat of the long-ruling authoritarian parties. So, maybe at some point we'll say the Malaysian system is actually democratic now, and then these oil states. So you can conclude just from this, if you did an actual statistical correlation, you'd find the same thing. There's a strong relationship between development and democracy. Stronger between human development and democracy than between per capita income and democracy. There's an even stronger correlation between development and overall levels of freedom, as in the Freedom House report. And if you take out the oil countries, obviously that correlation strengthens. So now we come to why. Any questions before I go on? Well, to summarize here from the Welzel and Engelhardt article, when you take a democracy score, in this case they're looking at the polity index. Polity doesn't look at civil liberties, it just looks at the structural features of democracy. But the correlation between that and the Human Development Index some years ago when they looked at it was 0.59 on the, these correlations can vary from -1 to +1. So things can be perfectly inversely correlated or perfectly positively correlated. But this will explain about 35% of the overall variance in democracy just by the Human Development Index alone. If you look at the Freedom House score and the Human Development Index, the correlation is a little stronger, 0.64. These are pretty strong correlations between truly independent variables. And then Welzel and Inglehart in their article, and then Inglehart and Welzel have a whole book that the article distills, which is a very, very important book in modernization theory. They developed a new scale. It's kind of like a measure of liberal democracy. They take the Freedom House score, which I would say is already kind of a measure of liberal democracy because they're looking not just at political structure, but the extent of political rights, the extent of civil liberties, the extent of rule of law, and then they multiply it by the score on the World Bank Anti-Corruption Index. Okay? So they get this powerful interaction term. They call that measure effective democracy. Effective democracy. And so then they ask, what is the correlation between that measure of effective democracy and the Human Development Index? And that is 0.77. That's a really high correlation between two completely different measures. It tells you something really powerful is going on, and they ask, why?